Before we dive in, I'd like to ask a small favor. I'm pouring all my energy into reaching my goal of 1,000 subscribers, which means the world to me. Please, I'm asking you to hit that subscribe button. It's just a single click, but it gives me tremendous motivation to keep creating more videos. Thank you so much.
Eleanor Winthrop did not weep on the morning of her sale. She stood before the mirror in her father's house, her fingers steady as she fastened the last button at her throat, repeating the mantra she'd recited every morning since the contract was signed. A woman's dignity is the one thing no man can put his name on. She harbored no illusions about Nathaniel Witmore. She had dissected every word of the marriage agreement and had already laid her own plans. The summer of 1815 bore down on Boston like an unpaid debt. Heat radiated from the cobblestones and the bay, and the air along Beacon Street carried the mingled scents of horse sweat and freshly cut flowers, the kind people ordered when they wished the world to believe something beautiful was happening. 300 guests had packed the White Clapper Church at Park in Tremont, fanning themselves with programs and leaning toward one another with the particular anticipation of those who had come not to celebrate a union, but to witness a spectacle. For everyone in Boston knew what this was. Nathaniel Witmore, 32, the wealthiest landowner in Massachusetts, a man whose name graced deeds and ledgers from the harbor to the Berkshires, had agreed to marry Eleanor Winthrop. And everyone also knew that Nathaniel Witmore had not agreed out of love, admiration, or any sentiment remotely resembling human warmth. He had agreed because Judge Winthrop held the deed to 300 acres of river-bottom land that Nate desperately needed to complete his northern expansion. The judge, a man who loved his daughter more than his pride, had drafted the contract himself, a marriage for land. It was a common transaction in houses like these, never spoken aloud, yet understood by all. What passed between the women in their silk bonnets and the men in their tall hats, however, was a different matter. Have you seen her? Plain as a barn door, they say. Quiet, keeps to herself. Nothing like her mother. Whitmore won't last a year before he takes a mistress. Lydia Sinclair was already seated in the third pew, clad in a bold, almost defiant shade of yellow. She smiled with the certainty of a woman who knew her own position. Lydia had known Nate for 6 years. She had dined at his table, ridden his horses, laughed at his jokes, and understood, with the clear-eyed practicality of one who had already survived a marriage, that what she and Nate shared was not something a piece of paper could erase. She had told him so 3 nights prior in the parlor of her rented townhouse on Commonwealth Avenue. "This changes nothing," she'd said, one hand resting on his lapel. Nate had not disagreed. He stood at the altar now, facing forward, jaw set, shoulders square in his charcoal wool coat. He was a tall man, dark-haired, with a face that lent severity the guise of strength. His hands were clasped behind his back. The minister was speaking, but Nate heard none of it. He was calculating. 300 acres, water access to the north, mill expansion by spring, a manageable arrangement, a business transaction swathed in white lace. His best man, Thomas Greer, leaned in. "She's late," Thomas murmured. "She'll come," Nate replied, his gaze fixed forward. "Her father will see to it." "Have you ever actually spoken to the woman?" "Once, at the Harmon dinner. She said very little." Thomas made a low sound in his throat. "Reckon that's a mercy? Quiet wives are easier to manage." Nate said nothing. He didn't particularly want a wife to manage. He wanted the riverland. Everything else was paperwork. The church doors opened. He didn't turn immediately. He was not the sort of man who turned around. He heard the subtle shift, the collective inhale that swept through the pews like wind through tall grass, starting at the back of the church and rolling forward, pew by pew, until it reached the front and washed over him like something he couldn't quite name. It was the sound of surprise, not polite surprise, not the gentle, practiced murmur of a Boston congregation acknowledging a bride. This was rarer. This was 300 people recalibrating. Thomas Greer, who had no such reservations, turned. "Nate," he said quietly, his voice altered. Nate turned. The woman walking down the aisle of Park Street Church on that sweltering July morning bore no resemblance to the creature Boston had spent 2 weeks describing. She was not plain. She was not mousy. She was not the forgettable daughter that gossip had painted in the space between dinner parties. Eleanor Winthrop walked as if she owned the floor beneath her feet. She wore ivory, simple, deliberately unadorned, her dark hair pinned low at the nape of her neck, adorned with a single small spray of wildflowers she had clearly chosen herself, for they were nothing like the elaborate arrangements her father's housekeeper had ordered. Her posture was precise. Her expression was composed in a way that transcended manners, transcended propriety. It was the composed expression of a woman who had made a decision and was not second-guessing it. She looked straight ahead, not at Nate, not at the congregation, but at some point just beyond the altar, as though she had fixed her gaze on something only she could see. Judge Winthrop walked beside her, stout, framed, and proud, his eyes suspiciously bright. He held his daughter's arm, the way a man holds something he loves and is about to hand over to someone he does not entirely trust. The whispers had stopped. That was the first thing Nate noticed. 300 people who had come for gossip had fallen suddenly, utterly silent. The second thing he noticed was that Eleanor had not looked at him once. When she reached the altar and her father placed her hand in Nate's, she finally turned. She met his eyes with a calm, direct, unhurried gaze and said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "Mr. Whitmore, I trust we understand each other." Nate blinked. "I beg your pardon." "The terms of this arrangement," she said, her voice low and even, with the careful diction of a woman who chose every word before releasing it. "I've read the contract, all 47 pages. I suspect you've read fewer." The minister cleared his throat and began. Nate stared at the woman standing beside him at the altar of Park Street Church and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the distinct discomfort of being caught off guard. The reception was held at the Whitmore estate, a federal-style mansion overlooking the harbor, all white columns and symmetrical windows, and the kind of formal gardens that were beautiful to behold but useless to inhabit. Nate's staff had been working for 3 days. The tables on the back lawn were draped in linen and heavy with silver. A string quartet played beneath the elm trees. Nate stood near the garden wall with a glass of Madeira he hadn't touched and watched his wife cross the lawn. She had been at it for 40 minutes, moving from group to group with a deliberateness that he was beginning to recognize as her natural mode of operation. Not circulating the way debutantes circulated, performing pleasure and gratitude, but actually talking. He had watched her spend 12 minutes with old Colonel Marsh, a man renowned for his inability to tolerate conversation with women, and somehow Marsh had laughed twice and was now holding forth with renewed animation on whatever subject she'd introduced. He'd watched her engage the Hadley sisters, the sharpest tongues in Boston's social circles, and not only survive the encounter, but leave them looking pleased with themselves, an achievement bordering on the miraculous. Thomas appeared at his elbow. "Remarkably well-managed woman," Thomas said. "Don't," Nate said. "I'm simply observing." "I heard what you're observing." Thomas sipped his wine. "I also observed that Lydia Sinclair left an hour ago without saying goodbye to the bride. Lydia doesn't concern me." "She will," Thomas said pleasantly, "if your wife is as sharp as she appears." Nate set his Madeira down on the nearest surface and crossed the lawn. Eleanor was speaking with Mrs. Aldrich, the wife of Boston's most prominent shipping merchant, when Nate reached them. She didn't break the conversation. She simply turned slightly, including him with a glance that was welcoming without being warm, and said, "Mr. Whitmore, Mrs. Aldrich was just telling me about the harbor expansion proposal. I was not aware your mill interests extended to shipping access." "They don't," Nate said, clipped. Eleanor returned her attention to Mrs. Aldrich. "I understand the Harbor Committee meets the 3rd Friday of the month. I should like to attend." Mrs. Aldrich looked startled, not displeased, but startled in the way people look when something outside their established categories appears before them. "The committee is well. It's generally, that is to say, it's largely composed of men." "Yes, I'm aware," Eleanor said pleasantly. "My father served on it for 11 years. I drafted 2 of his proposals." Mrs. Aldrich stared at her for a moment, then let out a short, genuine laugh. "My dear, I believe I like you." When Mrs. Aldrich had moved away, Nate turned to Eleanor. "You drafted your father's proposals," he said. "The ones that passed. He didn't mention that. No, Eleanor agreed. He wouldn't have. Men rarely mention the work their daughters do on their behalf. It complicates the narrative. Nate studied her, in the late afternoon light, with the harbor glittering behind her and the noise of the party swirling around them. He was trying to locate the woman he had expected. The quiet, manageable, financially useful woman of the contract, and finding something else entirely in her place. "What exactly do you want from this arrangement, Miss Winthrop?" He caught himself. "Mrs. Whitmore." She looked at him steadily. "What I want," she said, "is what I stated at the altar, that we understand each other. I am not here to be decorative, Mr. Whitmore. I am not here to be managed, or placated, or ignored. I have brought considerable assets to this marriage, including ones that do not appear on any deed. I intend to make use of them. You may find that advantageous, if you're willing to permit it." "And if I'm not willing?" "Then we will have a very long and very unpleasant life together," she said with perfect calm. "Your choice." She excused herself and returned to the guests. Nate stood alone by the garden wall for a long moment, watching her go. 3 weeks into their marriage, the household had rearranged itself. This was not something Nate had anticipated. He was accustomed to being the organizing principle of the Whitmore estate, the axis around which staff schedules and social obligations revolved. He gave direction. Things happened. The arrangement was simple and had never required renegotiation. Eleanor had not renegotiated it. She had simply begun operating alongside it, quietly, systematically, and with a thoroughness that made renegotiation unnecessary. By the time anyone noticed the new arrangement, it was already in place. She had introduced a new system for the household accounts. Not dramatic, not confrontational, simply more accurate. She had spoken with the cook about seasonal provisioning, and the result was that the household now spent 15% less on food and wasted nothing. She had met with Nate's land steward, a man named Collis, who had been with the estate for 20 years and regarded women's interest in property management with undisguised skepticism. And by the end of their second meeting, Collis had begun bringing his records to her first. Nate discovered this on a Tuesday morning when he went looking for Collis and found him in the east parlor with Eleanor. Both of them bent over a map of the northern acreage. He stood in the doorway. "Collis," he said. Both of them looked up. "Mr. Whitmore," Collis said, slightly flustered. Your wife had some questions about the drainage on the north field, and some observations," Eleanor added without looking flustered at all. "The eastern drainage channel is pulling water away from the flood risk area, but toward the root zones of the orchard. It'll weaken the trees within 2 growing seasons. Collis has the maps. We can address it before autumn, if you authorize the labor." Nate looked at Kiss. Kiss looked back at him with the expression of a man who has spent 20 years believing he was the smartest person in the room about soil and drainage, and has recently been required to revise this assessment. "She's right," Kalis said simply. "Sir." That evening after supper, Nate found Eleanor in the library. She was reading some treatise on agricultural economics that she'd apparently had shipped from Philadelphia, with her shoes off and her feet tucked beneath her on the chair, completely at ease, like a woman who had been comfortable in her own skin so long she'd forgotten there was any other way to be. He sat down across from her. "The drainage observation," he said. "How did you know?" She lowered the book slightly. "My father's estate in Concord had the same configuration. I watched it happen over 7 years. The trees died in the 8th. You managed your father's land?" "I observed it closely," she said. "There's a distinction. In this era, women are permitted to observe. Management is a different word." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the harbor committee. I assumed you had. It's not a conventional place for a woman." "No, it will cause comment." "Yes. Is that something you've considered?" Eleanor set the book down entirely. She looked at him with that direct, patient gaze, the one he was beginning to recognize as her version of taking a breath before she said something she had already decided to say. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I have been causing comment since I was 14 years old and corrected a Harvard professor's arithmetic at a dinner party. I have made my peace with it. The question is whether you have." Nate sat back in his chair. "My business reputation is enhanced," she said, "by a wife who understands commerce, or damaged if you prefer. by being the sort of man who keeps his wife in the parlor while she watches your investments decline. Those are both choices available to you. You're very confident, he said. And he was aware as he said it that it was not entirely a criticism. I'm accurate, she corrected. They're different things. He said nothing for a moment. The fire was low. The harbor sounds came in through the window. The creak of rigging, the distant bells of a vessel coming to anchor. Nate had grown up with those sounds. They had always meant money, resources, the machinery of a world he understood completely. Looking at the woman across from him, he had the particular, unfamiliar sensation of being in a room he did not fully understand. The committee meets Friday, he said at last. The third Friday, she agreed. Yes. I'll send a note to Aldrich. She picked up her book again. Thank you. She did not look triumphant. She did not look relieved. She looked exactly as she had before the conversation began. Composed, certain. A woman who had already done the work of deciding what she wanted, and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. Nate stood, moved toward the door, then stopped. The Harmon dinner, he said. When we met, you said very little. Eleanor glanced up. The edge of something not quite a smile moved across her face. I was assessing the room, she said. I knew what you were there for. I wanted to see how you operated before I decided how to proceed. And I decided, she said, that if I was going to be sold, I was going to negotiate the terms. The not-quite smile held for just a moment. Then she returned to her book. Nate walked out of the library and stood alone in the hall for a long moment in the heavy summer dark of the house he had always owned, and was only now beginning to think of as something that might, with time, resemble a home. The first real fracture came on a Thursday. Nate had come in late from a meeting at the counting house, a protracted, frustrating negotiation with a mill supplier who had doubled his prices on the basis of nothing Nate could identify, except the man's awareness that he had Nate at a disadvantage. He was tired and irritable, and not inclined toward conversation. He was not expecting to find Lydia Sinclair in his front parlor. She was seated on the best settee, wearing a deep blue traveling dress, with the composed expression of a woman who had calculated the risks of this visit and decided they were acceptable. Lydia, Nate said. Nathan, she rose. I hope you'll forgive the hour. I was passing through Beacon Street, and I've been meaning to speak with you since the wedding. This isn't a good time. It never is, lately. Her voice was light, but her eyes were not. I feel as though you've become rather difficult to reach. I've been occupied. Yes, she said. I've heard. He heard it in her voice, the things she didn't say. He had known Lydia long enough to read her silences. Whatever you've heard, he said, ought to stay wherever you heard it. Nathan, Lydia. His voice was quiet and final. You know, I have always valued your friendship. I intend to continue doing so. But you came to my house without an invitation, and at an hour when my wife might reasonably be expected to be at home, and I need you to understand what that means. Lydia looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face, something too quick and too complicated to be simply anger. She's changed you, Lydia said. And you've barely known her a month. Nobody's changed me, Nate said. I'm simply honoring an arrangement. Is that all it is? It wasn't a question. Nate didn't treat it as one. Good evening, Lydia, he said. She left. He stood in the empty parlor for a moment, then turned to find Eleanor at the top of the stairs. She was still dressed. She had clearly heard every word. Their eyes met across the length of the hallway. Nate waited for something. The accusation, the question, the display of wounded dignity that he had been braced for in the back of his mind since Lydia walked through the door. Eleanor said nothing. She simply looked at him for a measured moment, then turned and walked back toward the east wing. He followed her. Eleanor, and she stopped at the door of the sitting room, but didn't turn around. I don't need an explanation, she said, her voice even. We entered this arrangement with our eyes open. I have no illusions about what your life looked like before the contract was signed. That's not what concerns me, she continued, turning. Now is that she came here, to this house, and that means she will come again, or someone like her will, and eventually it will be in front of people who matter. And then it will be my problem whether I chose to make it one or not. Nate looked at her. What are you asking me? I'm not asking you anything, Eleanor said. I'm informing you of a consequence. You're a practical man. I assume you'll address it accordingly. You're angry." "Of course I'm angry," she said, with a directness that startled him. Not a performance of anger, not tears or raised voices, but the clean, frank admission of it, like she'd decided long ago that pretending to feel less than she did was a waste of both their time. "I'm angry because I have conducted myself with absolute propriety in a situation I did not design, and I will not have that undermined by a woman in a blue dress who walks into my house uninvited. That is what I'm angry about, not whatever you were to each other before." She held his gaze. "Do you understand the difference?" she asked. He did. "Yes," he said. "Good." She turned away again. "Then we understand each other, as usual." She closed the sitting room door behind her. Nate stood alone in the hall. The harbor bells rang the hour outside. 9 o'clock. On a Thursday in July, in the summer of 1815, and Nathaniel Witmore stood in the corridor of his own house and felt the slow, grinding recognition of a man who has spent his whole life measuring things and has just encountered something that does not fit any unit of measure he possesses. He had thought, 3 weeks ago, that this marriage was a transaction. He was beginning to suspect that he had been wrong, not about the transaction, that was real enough, and the Riverland was exactly what he needed, but about the woman. He had looked at Eleanor Winthrop on the steps of Park Street Church and seen a liability he intended to manage, a complication he intended to minimize. He was beginning to understand, standing alone in his hallway on a summer night, with the sound of her door still ringing in the silence, that what he had seen was not what was there, and that the distance between what he had assumed and what was true was going to require something of him that he was not entirely sure he knew how to give. He put his hand flat against the wall. He stood there a long time. He didn't sleep well that night. This was new. Nathaniel Witmore had always been a man who slept the way he did everything else, efficiently, without excess, and without regret. He had built that capacity deliberately, over years of hard decisions and harder consequences, and he had been quietly proud of it, in the way that men are proud of things they believe mark them as different from ordinary men. He lay awake until past 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, listening to the harbor. He was not thinking about Lydia. He was thinking about Eleanor, standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at him with that measuring, furious, completely controlled gaze and saying, "I'm angry because I have conducted myself with absolute propriety in a situation I did not design." He kept turning the sentence over, not because it was remarkable. It was objectively a reasonable thing to say. He kept turning it over because of the way she had said it, not as an accusation, not as a demand for sympathy, but as a statement of fact, delivered by a woman who had decided that accuracy was more important than performance, even when what was accurate was inconvenient. He had known a great many women in his 32 years. He had not known one quite like that. He rose before 6 and was at his desk by the time the household was properly awake, working through correspondence with the kind of focused energy that comes from having something you're deliberately not thinking about. He was halfway through a letter to his mill superintendent when the door opened and Eleanor appeared, already dressed, already carrying a leather folio he had come to recognize as her version of a briefcase. She stopped when she saw him. "You're up early," she said. "So are you. I have the committee meeting." He had forgotten it was Friday. He set down his pen. "I'll come with you." She looked at him for a moment. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said. "I said I would come." Something shifted in her expression, too quick to name. There and gone. "All right," she said. "I'll be ready in 20 minutes." The harbor committee met in a low-ceilinged room above the Aldrich counting house, and when Nate walked in with Eleanor, 6 men looked up from their chairs with the unified expression of people confronted by a category error. Franklin Aldrich recovered first. He was a broad, ruddy-faced man, with the kind of confidence that came from 30 years of being right about shipping, and he extended his hand to Nate with genuine warmth before turning to Eleanor with something that was trying to be warmth and landing closer to polite bewilderment. "Mrs. Whitmore, we weren't expecting." "My husband mentioned the meeting," Eleanor said pleasantly. "I hope you don't mind. I have some thoughts on the Northern Channel proposal that may be useful." A man at the far end of the table, Nate recognized him as Silas Kearney, who controlled a third of the dock labor in Boston, shifted in his chair, and did not bother to arrange his expression into anything resembling welcome. "Whitmore," Kearney said, looking at Nate. "This is a working committee." "I'm aware," Nate said. "We don't generally." Eleanor pulled out a chair and sat down with the focused calm of a woman who had been told she did not belong in rooms her entire life and had developed a thorough immunity to the sensation. She opened her folio. The Northern Channel proposal, as currently written, would reduce shipping transit time by approximately 4%, while increasing toll revenue by 11%. Those are the numbers being used to justify the expansion. They are also the wrong numbers. Kearney stared at her. "I beg your pardon. The projection assumes consistent water depth through the secondary inlet," Eleanor said, turning a page. "The depth data used is from 1808. The inlet has silted significantly since then. I have documentation from 2 captains who ran aground there last autumn, both of whom filed reports with the Port Authority that appear not to have reached this committee. If the inlet isn't dredged first, the transit time improvement drops to less than 1%, and the toll revenue projection collapses." Silence. Franklin Aldrich leaned forward. "Where did you get the Port Authority reports?" "I asked for them," Eleanor said. "The office is open to the public on Tuesdays." Another silence, different from the first one. This one had a texture to it. The particular quality of silence that falls when several intelligent men realize simultaneously that they have been working from bad data for an unknown period of time, and the person who has just told them so is a woman who was not supposed to be in the room. Nate sat back in his chair and said nothing. He watched Eleanor methodically work through the documentation she had prepared. He watched Kearney's hostility transition, with visible reluctance, into attention. He watched Aldrich stop performing welcome and start actually listening. He watched 4 other men adjust their postures by degrees, the way men do when they are recalibrating without wanting anyone to notice them do it. By the end of the meeting, the Northern Channel vote had been tabled pending a new depth survey. Eleanor's documentation had been entered into the official record. In the street afterward, Nate walked beside her without speaking for half a block. "You've had those reports for how long?" he finally said. 3 weeks, she said. "Since before the wedding. Since before I agreed to the marriage contract," she corrected. "I wanted to understand what assets were actually in play. Your harbor interests were part of that." He stopped walking. She took 2 more steps before she realized it and turned back. "You researched my business holdings before the wedding," he said. "I researched everything," she said. "I told you at the altar. I read the contract. All of it. That's not the same as Port Authority reports." "No," she agreed. "It's more thorough." He stared at her. A carriage moved past them on the street. Somewhere nearby, a vendor was calling out the price of summer peaches. "Why?" he said. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Because I had no choice about whether to marry you. I had a great deal of choice about how. I intended to be an asset, Mr. Whitmore, not a liability. That required information." He stood there in the summer heat of Beacon Street, and something that had been sitting behind his sternum for 3 weeks shifted very slightly and settled into a new position. "Nate," he said. She blinked. "What?" "My name," he said. "You can use it." A pause, brief but real. "All right," she said. "Nate." The talk started the following week. Nate heard it first from Thomas, who had the particular gift of absorbing social information, the way harbor water absorbs everything indiscriminately and completely. "People are talking about your wife," Thomas said over brandy at the club on Monday evening. "People have been talking about my wife since the wedding," Nate said. "This is different talk." Thomas set down his glass. "Kearney's been at the tavern saying she embarrassed the committee, saying, 'You let her make fools of them.' She corrected a data error that would have cost the harbor expansion 2 seasons of revenue. That is not the version Kearney is telling." Nate's jaw tightened. "What version is Kearney telling?" "That you've lost control of your household," Thomas said with the directness of a man who considers it an act of friendship to deliver bad news plainly. "That the Whitmore name is being managed by a woman who doesn't know her place. You know how it goes, Nate. It doesn't matter if she was right. Half those men left that room feeling diminished, and diminished men talk. Let them talk." You have mill contracts up for renewal with 2 of those men. Nate was quiet. It's not fair, Thomas said more gently. I know it isn't, but you asked me to be honest with you. He went home in a state he recognized as anger, but couldn't entirely locate the target for. He found Eleanor in the east parlor, with Collis going over the autumn planting schedule. She read his face the moment he walked in. Collis, she said, will finish tomorrow. Collis took his maps and left with the air of a man grateful to exit a room before whatever was about to happen actually happened. Eleanor turned to Nate. What's wrong? Kearney, Nate said. He's talking about the committee meeting. I expected that. Did you? He's embarrassed. She said he was working from bad numbers, and a woman caught it in front of his colleagues. Of course he's talking. What is he saying? That I've lost control of my household. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. And do you believe that? No, he said immediately and with a certainty that surprised him slightly. She nodded once. Then the question is what you want to do about it. I'm not going to ask you to disappear from committees to manage Silas Kearney's dignity, he said, if that's what you're braced for. Something moved through her eyes. That is not what I was braced for, she said. But I appreciate it. What I am going to do, Nate said, is make it very clear to certain people that your presence at that committee had my full endorsement, and that the Harbor Committee is better served for it. That may not silence Kearney, but it will limit the damage. It will also associate your name with mine more directly, Eleanor said. People may read that as confirmation that she runs the household and he follows, or they may read it as a man who knows the value of what's in front of him, Nate said. She looked at him. That measuring, steady look that he had stopped finding unsettling and had started finding, in some complicated way he had not yet fully examined, studying. All right, she said softly. The twist came on a Wednesday, and it came from a direction Nate had not anticipated. He was at the counting house when his clerk brought him a letter. Heavy paper, good quality, sealed with wax that had been pressed by a ring he recognized. He recognized it because he had seen it before, years ago, on papers he had spent considerable energy trying to forget. His uncle, Cornelius Whitmore, Boston's other great landholder, the one Nate had not spoken to in 6 years, since the inheritance dispute that had ended with Nate keeping the estate, and Cornelius taking his grudge across the river to Cambridge. He broke the seal. The letter was short. Cornelius had always preferred brevity when he was being dangerous. Dear Nathaniel, I write to inform you that I have retained counsel in the matter of the Concord River acreage. As you may be aware, the deed transfer associated with your recent marriage contract contains a survey error that places approximately 40 acres of the transferred land in dispute. My counsel believes the error is recoverable. I suggest we speak before this reaches the courts. Your uncle. C.W. Nate read the letter twice. Then he put it in his coat pocket, told his clerk he was not to be disturbed for the remainder of the afternoon, and walked the 3 miles home without taking a carriage, because he needed the time. He went directly to the library. Eleanor was there. She was always there in the afternoons. She looked up from her reading. One look at his face and she set the book down. What happened? He took out the letter and placed it on the table in front of her. She read it. He watched her read it, watched the stillness in her face stay perfectly in place until she reached the second paragraph, and then watched something tighten almost imperceptibly around her eyes. She set the letter down. The survey error, she said. You know about it. I suspected it, she said. There was an inconsistency in the original Concord deeds. The 1803 survey and the 1811 survey didn't match on the northeastern boundary. I raised it with my father before the contract was signed. He said it had been resolved. It apparently was not resolved. No, she said. It was not. Nate pulled out a chair and sat down. Eleanor, if Cornelius takes this to the courts and wins the 40 acres in question, include the primary water access point for the northern mill expansion. Without that access, the entire expansion is non-viable. She said, I know the marriage contract. The marriage contract specified the acreage, and if the survey is wrong, the acreage specified may not be fully transferable. Yes, I've worked through the implications just now, in the last 30 seconds, she said evenly. I'm fast with numbers. He stared at her. Are you angry at your father? Extraordinarily, she said without heat. But that will keep. What won't keep is Cornelius. He wouldn't have written unless he had already done the work. He's not a man who telegraphs a threat without a weapon behind it. No, Nate agreed. He isn't. Then we need to move faster than he does, Eleanor said. Do you have the original 1803 survey documents in the estate records? Yes. And the 1811 survey somewhere. I'd need to locate it. Locate it tonight, she said. I need to compare them against the deed language in the marriage contract. There may be a defensible interpretation of the boundary that doesn't require a court ruling. If the language is ambiguous enough, we may be able to settle it with a corrected survey rather than litigation. And if we can't, Eleanor picked up the letter, folded it, and placed it precisely on the corner of the table. Then we litigate, she said, and we win. She said it with a complete absence of drama. No bravado, no performance. Just a woman who had assessed a problem and arrived at its logical conclusion. You sound certain, he said. I'm not certain, she said, but Cornelius is banking on the assumption that you'll handle this the way men handle things, loudly, expensively, and through channels that favor whoever has the most patience for drawn-out proceedings. I'm suggesting we handle it differently. How? By being right before he can be wrong, she said. Get me the documents. They worked until past midnight. This was not a thing Nate had imagined would happen, sitting across a library table from his wife of 4 weeks, surrounded by survey maps and deed transcriptions, and the burned-down stubs of 3 candles, arguing about boundary language and property law, with the concentrated urgency of 2 people who have temporarily set aside every other consideration because the problem in front of them is too important to approach any other way. Eleanor worked with a precision that he had stopped being surprised by and started simply watching, the way you watch someone do something they were built to do. She moved between documents with the ease of someone who had been reading legal language since before it was considered appropriate for her to do so. She found the inconsistency in the 1811 survey. Within 20 minutes, a transcription error in the northeastern boundary description that had been copied incorrectly from the original survey notes and had propagated through every subsequent document. There, she said, pointing. Nate leaned over her shoulder. The bearing notation, he murmured. It should read north 62 degrees east. It was recorded as north 62 degrees west. One word, the wrong direction entirely. The boundary was drawn correctly on the ground. The surveyor's field notes confirm it, but the transcribed document is wrong. And that's the document Cornelius will be using. So, the land was always ours. The error is in the paperwork, Nate said. Yes, which means we don't need to defend a legal claim. We need to correct a clerical record. That's a substantially easier argument. He'll still fight it. Let him, she said. He'll be fighting the surveyor's own field notes. His counsel will advise him to settle within the month. She sat back in her chair. The candlelight was low, and she had been leaning over documents for 3 hours. An ink stain bloomed on the side of her right hand, unnoticed. Her hair had loosened slightly from its pins. She looked nothing like the composed, architecturally precise woman who had walked down the aisle of Park Street Church. She looked like someone who had just won a fight and was still too focused to realize it. Eleanor, Nate said. She looked up. Thank you, he said. She seemed momentarily uncertain what to do with that. Not suspicious, exactly. Not like she thought there was something behind the words, but simply unused to them in this particular configuration. You would have found it, she said. I would not have found it, he said. Not tonight. Probably not before Cornelius had us in front of a judge. Well, she glanced down at the ink stain on her hand, then back up. It was my land too. 4 words, simple, declarative, entirely without performance. It was my land too, said like a woman who had finally, at this table with these documents, stopped being careful about whether she was saying too much. Nate held her gaze. Yes, he said. For the first time since he had known her, Eleanor Winthrop Whitmore did not have an immediate answer ready. She held his gaze for just a moment. 1 beat, 2, and then she looked down at the documents and began neatly organizing them for morning. We should get these to your solicitor first thing, she said. before Cornelius can file anything. First thing, he agreed. He gathered the survey maps. She stacked the deed copies. They worked in a silence that was entirely different from the silences they had moved through in the first weeks of the marriage. Different in the way that a room is different after a fire that burned cold and controlled instead of wild, leaving everything standing but changed in temperature. He took the documents to his desk. She replaced the candle stubs and closed the map case. At the door of the library, she paused. "Nate." He looked up. "Your uncle," she said. "He didn't write to you out of genuine belief in his legal claim. The error was too small, too technical. He had to work to find it, which means he was looking for something to use." "I know," Nate said. "Which means," she said, "that someone told him to look." The room went very still. He had not gotten there yet. He had been too focused on the legal problem, the mechanical urgency of the solution. He had not yet backed up far enough to ask the prior question, the one that now sat in the room between them with the cold weight of something that had been there all along, waiting to be named. Who had told Cornelius Whitmore to look at the survey records? Who had known enough about the marriage contract to know where to look? Who had both the motive and the access? He thought of yellow silk in a third-row pew. He thought of a blue traveling dress on his best settee. He thought of a woman who had said, "This changes nothing," with the certainty of someone who intended to make it true by whatever means were available. "Lydia," he said. Eleanor's expression did not change. "I don't know that," she said carefully. "I have no proof. I simply want you to consider the question." "You've already considered it." "I've considered it since I read the letter," she said. "Yes." He stood behind his desk in the late-night quiet of his library and looked at his wife of 4 weeks, who had spent 3 hours solving a legal problem, who had found a transcription error in documents that predated their marriage, who had done all of it with the focused precision of someone who understood exactly what was at stake, not just for the estate, but for the both of them. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice had changed, dropped into something lower and more unguarded than he was accustomed to allowing. "When this is resolved, Cornelius, the survey, all of it, I want to revisit certain things." She waited. "The way this household operates," he said formally, "I want to document it differently. Your role in the estate decisions, I should have done it from the beginning, and I didn't, because I was operating from assumptions that were wrong, and I'm not going to keep operating from them." She was very still. "You mean a formal agreement?" "I mean your name on the documents," he said, "the ones that matter. If we're doing this, if this is what this is, then it should be real." She held his gaze for a long moment. "We'll discuss it," she said finally, "when Cornelius is handled." "We'll discuss it," he agreed. She left. He stood alone in his library, surrounded by survey maps and the ghosts of 3 burned-down candles, and thought about the question she had left in the room. Not the question about Lydia, though that saddened him like a cold stone, solid and sharp-edged. The other question, the one behind it, the one that a man asks himself when he has spent 32 years believing he knows how the world works, and has spent 4 weeks having that belief dismantled with surgical precision by a woman he had agreed to marry for 300 acres of riverland. What exactly, Nathaniel Witmore asked himself in the summer dark of his own house. Have I been looking at this whole time? And underneath that question, quieter and more dangerous, and what does it mean that I'm only now beginning to see it? The solicitor's name was Hargrove, and he was the kind of man who communicated alarm exclusively through the careful absence of expression. The more alarmed he was, the more perfectly blank his face became. When Nate and Eleanor laid the survey documents on his desk the following morning, Hargrove's face went so completely blank that it was nearly sculptural. He read for 11 minutes without speaking. Then he set down the papers, folded his hands, and said, "The correction is sound and defensible." "Against a court challenge?" Eleanor said. "Yes, the surveyor's field notes are definitive. The transcription error is provable, and the original boundary intent is clear." He paused. "The question is speed. If Cornelius files before we can register the correction with the land office, we may have to defend it publicly rather than correct it quietly. Public proceedings take time. Time is money." "How long do we have?" Nate said. "If Cornelius moves today, which he may. 2 days, perhaps 3. Then we move today, Eleanor said. Hargrove looked at her. Then he looked at Nate. Then he looked back at Eleanor, with the expression of a man who is revising a professional assumption in real time. I'll need both signatures, he said. You have us both, Eleanor said. Jack. They had the corrected survey filed by 4 o'clock that afternoon. Cornelius's counsel arrived at the land office at 9 o'clock the following morning. The clerk informed them, with the particular pleasantness of a man delivering news he personally enjoys, that the matter had already been resolved. Thomas told Nate about it over breakfast on Thursday, grinning in the specific way he grinned when things went sideways for people he did not like. Counsel walked in ready for war, Thomas said. Walked out with nothing. Apparently, they stood there for 10 minutes reading the corrected filing before they believed it was real. Good, Nate said. Your uncle is furious. He'll recover. He's saying... Thomas stopped. Nate looked up from his coffee. What is he saying? Thomas set down his fork. He's saying your wife managed you into surrendering the dispute before you could evaluate it properly, that you were manipulated. The dining room was very quiet for a moment. Cornelius, Nate said with absolute evenness, spent 6 years trying to take this estate through every legal channel available to him, and failed every time. He can say whatever he likes about my wife. It changes the filing. Not at all. I know that, Thomas said. I'm just telling you what's moving through the clubs, and the clubs can say whatever they like as well. Eleanor appeared in the doorway. She had clearly heard the last exchange. She met Nate's eyes briefly, and he saw the question in hers. How much? He answered it with a slight shake of his head. Enough. Don't worry about it. She nodded once and came to the table. Thomas, she said pleasantly. Still here, leaving momentarily? Thomas said, with the ease of a man who had made his peace with Eleanor Witmore somewhere around the 2nd week of the marriage. Congratulations on the survey matter, by the way. Masterfully handled. Thank you, she said. How is Cornelius? Thomas laughed out loud, livid. Good, she said, and reached for the coffee. The letter from the mill arrived 3 days later. Nate's superintendent at the Whitmore textile mill in Lell was a man named Prescott, competent, experienced, and deeply disinclined toward drama, which was why the letter's tone alarmed Nate before he had finished the first paragraph. He read it standing at his desk. Then he read it again. What is it? Eleanor said from across the room. He handed it to her. She read it faster than he had. Her face did the thing it did when she was processing urgency. Perfectly still on the surface, something moving fast behind her eyes. The boiler, she said. The east boiler has been running over pressure for 3 weeks. Prescott says the safety valve was replaced last month with an undersized component. The supplier sent the wrong part, and nobody caught it. Nobody caught it for 3 weeks, Nate said, his voice dropping. The foreman who would have caught it was dismissed in June, cost-cutting measure by the previous site manager. Eleanor set the letter down. How many workers on that floor? 60, maybe 70, during peak shifts. The silence was brief and total. When did Prescott write this? She said. 4 days ago. Nate, her voice had changed. Not louder, not more agitated, but tighter, compressed like a woman forcing a great deal of force through a small, precise opening. If that boiler has been running over pressure for 3 weeks, and the letter took 4 days to reach us. I know, he said. He was already moving. I'll go today. I'm coming with you, he turned. Eleanor, 60 workers, she said. Nate, I'm coming. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Be ready in an hour, he said. The road to Lell was 4 hours in good conditions. They made it in 3.5, changing horses at the midpoint relay and not stopping for anything else. Eleanor spent most of the journey reading. She had pulled Prescott's previous 3 monthly reports from the estate files before they left and was working through them with a pencil, marking things. Nate watched her from the corner of his eye and thought about what it had taken him this long to understand, that she was never not working. Not in an anxious, compulsive way. In the way that a person works when they believe the work matters. Anything in the earlier reports? He said. Yes, she said without looking up. The boiler pressure readings have been noted as elevated since May. It's in the figures, just never flagged as a priority concern. If someone had been looking for it, they would have seen it 2 months ago. The former foreman almost certainly. His dismissal was the gap. She turned to Paige. What was the reason given for cutting the position? Annual cost review. 5% reduction in floor supervisory staff. She was quiet for a moment. Who authorized it? The site manager. Harlow, he answered to me. And you didn't review the specific cuts? No. He said it cost him something to say it simply like that, without excuses, but he said it. Eleanor looked up from the reports. She didn't look accusatory. She looked like a woman who had already moved past the question of blame and was focused entirely on what came next. When we get there, she said, you handle Prescott and the boiler. I'll talk to the workers. The workers don't need. They're frightened. She said they've been working next to an unsafe boiler for 3 weeks, and they know it. Because workers always know. They need someone to tell them they were right to be afraid, and that it's being fixed. You'll be managing the mechanical problem. Someone needs to manage the human one. He held her gaze. All right, he said. Prescott met them at the mill entrance with the expression of a man who had been carrying a crisis alone for 4 days, and was experiencing the specific relief of no longer being alone in it. He was a compact, gray-haired man with mill-roughened hands and the careful, watchful manner of someone who had spent 30 years learning to read machinery. Mr. Whitmore, he shook Nate's hand hard. Thank God we've been running reduced pressure since yesterday. I made the call to shut down 2/3 of the east floor. Production's down 40%, but I wasn't willing to. You made the right call, Nate said. Show me. Prescott led them through the mill floor. Eleanor peeled off at the entrance to the main workroom without being asked. Nate watched her move toward a cluster of women at the nearest looms, some of the younger workers who had stopped pretending to work and were watching the owner's arrival with the cautious attention of people who have learned that arrivals like this usually precede something bad. He heard her say, as he moved away, My name is Eleanor Witmore. I want to hear what you've been dealing with, and he heard a woman's voice answer, tired and weary. You really want to know, ma'am? I really do, Eleanor said. Then Prescott was pulling him toward the east boiler room, and he turned his attention to the problem in front of him. The boiler was worse than the letter had described. The safety valve, the undersized replacement, was visibly struggling. Nate could see the stress in the fitting from 3 feet away. Prescott pointed out the pressure gauge, which was reading in territory that made Nate's stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with money. How long? Nate said. At current reduced pressure. Could be days, could be hours. The metal's fatigued. It's been running hot since May. You can see the discoloration on the casing. When it goes, it won't be a leak. It'll be a rupture. Yes, sir. Evacuate the east wing, Nate said. Now, full shutdown. The production loss. I don't care about the production loss, Nate said. Get everyone out of the east wing. Then get me whoever installed that valve. Prescott moved fast. Nate was already calculating replacement valve proper specifications. Emergency suppliers, low lead time, repair time, inspection time before they could safely restart. The numbers were painful but survivable. What was not survivable was the alternative. He walked back through the mill floor. Eleanor was still with the workers. She had gathered not just the cluster of young women, but a significant portion of the floor, 30, 40 people standing in a loose group around her, and she was talking, and they were listening with the focused attention of people who have not been listened to in return for a very long time. Nate caught pieces of it as he crossed the floor. The valve will be replaced today. The boiler will not restart until it has been inspected by 2 independent engineers. That is not a promise I'm making to reassure you. It is a commitment I am making in front of all of you, so that you can hold me to it. A man near the back, older, broad-shouldered, with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to absorbing hard news, raised his hand. Mrs. Whitmore, the workers on the east floor have lost 2 days' wages from the reduced schedule. We've got families. Eleanor didn't hesitate. Lost wages for the days the east floor operated under reduced capacity will be paid in full. You were asked to bear the cost of a management failure. That's not acceptable. A murmur through the crowd, not skeptical, surprised. How do we know? someone started. Because I'm telling you, Eleanor said, and I do not make statements I cannot support. Mr. Prescott will have written confirmation by end of day. Nate reached her side. She glanced at him, a quick, questioning look. Full shutdown, he said quietly, for her alone. East Wing. You're right about the wages. Something moved through her eyes. Are you certain? I'm certain, he said. She turned back to the workers. Mr. Whitmore has authorized the full shutdown and confirmed the wage commitment. If anyone has further concerns, I will be in the mill office for the next 2 hours. My door will be open. The older man near the back looked at Nate for a long moment. Then he looked at Eleanor. Then he said, in the measured way of a man choosing his words with care, "Thank you, ma'am." It was 2 words. It carried the weight of a great deal more. The replacement valve supplier was found by 3 o'clock. By 5 o'clock, Nate was in the boiler room with a lowly engineer named Chadwick, overseeing the fitting himself, not managing from a distance, physically present in the heat and the noise, making sure the work was done correctly. Chadwick was the kind of man who respected this. He said very little, worked very precisely, and paused only once, when a fitting proved more corroded than anticipated, and the casing around the old valve needed to be worked carefully to prevent further stress on the already fatigued metal. Easy, Nate said. I know, Chadwick said. If that casing cracks, it won't. Chadwick said. Give me 10 minutes. It took 8. The new valve seated cleanly. Chadwick ran through the inspection protocol with methodical calm, and when he was done, he straightened up and said, "She'll hold. You want the second engineer here before you restart. Tomorrow morning," Nate said. Nothing runs until he's cleared it. Understood. He walked back through the empty east wing, evacuated machinery, still silent in a way that working mills never were. He was hot, and his coat was marked with grease at the cuff, and he was thinking about 60 workers and a safety valve, and a foreman whose position had been eliminated for 5% of a budget line, and the specific weight of a decision that had seemed purely numerical until it had a human face attached to it. Eleanor was in the mill office. She was still there. She had said 2 hours and had apparently meant it literally. There were 3 workers with her when he opened the door, and she was writing something in her folio, nodding as one of them spoke. She looked up when Nate entered. "Give us 5 minutes," she said to the workers. They filed out. One of them, a young woman, perhaps 19, with tired eyes, paused at the door and said, very quietly, "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore." Eleanor nodded. "Get some rest tonight." The door closed. Nate sat down. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the physical work. "How bad was it?" Eleanor said. "Bad enough. The valve is replaced. The east wing stays down until tomorrow's second inspection, and the foreman in position." He looked at her. Reinstated. "I'll have Prescott post the notice tomorrow." She nodded. She was watching him with an expression he had not seen from her before. Not the measuring look, not the composed assessment, something quieter, something that was paying attention to him rather than to the problem. "You went into the boiler room yourself," she said. "Prescott was there." "I know. I heard. The workers know too." She paused. "That matters to them more than you might think." He leaned back in the chair. "Tell me what I missed in those conversations," she told him. She had spent 2 hours gathering an account of the mill's internal management from the workers' perspective. Not complaints, not grievances, but information. Who made which decisions, which safety shortcuts had become habitual, where the reporting chains had silently failed. She told it plainly, without editorializing, presenting what she'd heard like evidence rather than argument. By the end, Nate was sitting forward again, elbows on the desk. "There are 3 other positions that were cut in the June reduction," he said. "Floor supervisory. Yes, I have the names. Reinstate all 3. The cost? Eleanor," he said. "I have 300 acres of riverland because you found a transcription error at midnight. Reinstating 3 positions is not a financial problem." She looked at him steadily. Then something happened that he had not yet seen in 2 months of marriage. Eleanor Witmore smiled. Not the edge of something, not the almost smile he had glimpsed twice before. A real one. Brief, genuine, slightly startled looking, as though it had arrived before she'd fully decided to allow it. "All right," she said. They stayed the night at the mill manager's house. the only accommodation Prescott could arrange on short notice. It was modest, overcrowded with Prescott's family, and entirely lacking in any of the formality that the Whitmore estate had maintained as a kind of buffer between Nate and Eleanor's carefully negotiated household arrangement. They were given the same room. This had happened before. Technically, they shared a household, but the Whitmore estate was large enough that the sharing had been architectural rather than actual. This was different. This was a single room with a single window and a writing desk that Nate immediately occupied because it was something to do. And Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and took her hair down with the practical efficiency of a woman who had decided that dignity required adaptation, not performance. Nate kept his eyes on his correspondence. "The Harlow problem," Eleanor said. He looked up. "What about it?" "Harlow authorized the supervisory cuts. He also approved the valve replacement without checking the specifications. That's not incompetence. That's a pattern." "I know. Do you know why?" He set down his pen. "Tell me what you think." "I think," she said carefully, "that someone with an interest in your mill, running less efficiently than it should, might find it useful to have the right person in a supervisory position. Someone who makes decisions that look like normal cost-cutting, but whose cumulative effect is structural weakness." The room went very still. "You're suggesting Harlow was placed." "I'm suggesting it's worth asking who recommended him for the position," he thought. "Kearney," he said slowly. "Kearney recommended Harlow 2 years ago, before the Harbor Committee. And Kearney," Eleanor said with the precise, measured tone of a woman laying down a final card, "was at Lydia Sinclair's dinner party in June. Thomas mentioned it. I filed it away." Nate was very still. The connections assembled themselves in the silence of the room, one after another, with the relentless logic of a structure that has been standing a long time, waiting for someone to look at it from the right angle. Lydia, Kearney, Harlow, Cornelius. Not a conspiracy of dramatic proportion. Something more ordinary, and therefore more dangerous. A network of people with individual grievances and overlapping interests, each pursuing their own advantage, connected by the single thread of wanting Nathaniel Witmore diminished. And none of them had counted on Eleanor. "She didn't just go to Cornelius," Nate said. "I don't think so," Eleanor said. "No, she's been at this since before the wedding. The timing fits." Eleanor's voice was even, but her hands, he noticed, were very still in her lap, the particular stillness of controlled anger. "Kearney's hostility at the Harbor Committee wasn't about me correcting the data. He was already hostile before I opened the folio. Someone had prepared him. She told him you were coming. She told him something." Eleanor said, "I can't know exactly what, but the effect was that the room was arranged against me before I walked through the door, and I still managed to correct the record, and that was not the outcome anyone had planned for." Nate stood up from the desk. He crossed the room and stood at the window, hands in his pockets, looking at nothing. "Eleanor," he said, "I owe you an apology." A pause. "For what specifically?" "For every assumption I made before I knew you," he said. "For the fact that you walked into this marriage with enemies you hadn't made yet, because of who you were marrying. For the fact that you have handled it all, of it, without asking me for anything except to be taken seriously." The silence was different from every silence they had shared before. Warmer, more dangerous. "I am asking now," she said quietly, "if you're willing." He turned from the window. "What are you asking for?" She met his eyes. "I want to deal with Lydia Sinclair," she said. "Not reactively, strategically. I want to close this network before it costs us anything else. And I want to do it in a way that makes it permanently clear that the Whitmore name is not available to be used as a mechanism for someone else's ambition." "How?" "I have a plan," she said, "but I need you to trust me completely. Not mostly, not when it's convenient, completely." He looked at her. This woman who had found a survey error at midnight, who had stood in front of 60 frightened workers and made them a promise, who then made him keep it, who had assembled a network of subtle destruction from fragments of information, while he had been looking at the obvious problems directly in front of him. "You have had my trust," he said, "for longer than I've admitted it." Something moved through her face, complex, real, not entirely composed. "Then here is what we're going to do," she said. And outside the mill manager's window, the summer night pressed down on Lel, hot and heavy, and full of the sound of machinery that had stopped just in time. And inside the room, Eleanor Witmore leaned forward and began to speak. And Nathaniel Witmore listened with his whole attention, not as a man managing a business problem, not as a man who had married for land, but as a man who had finally, at the cost of 2 months and a near disaster and a filing error and a boiler valve, understood what was actually in front of him. Eleanor's plan was not what he expected. He had anticipated something legal, something involving Hargrove and documents and the methodical dismantling of Lydia's network through the same careful channels Eleanor had used on Cornelius. He was prepared for that. He understood that kind of warfare. What she described instead was something else entirely. A dinner party, he said. Yes? You want to host a dinner party? I want to host the dinner party, Eleanor said. The one that Boston has been waiting for. The Whitmore estate formal invitation list. The full social weight of the name behind it. And I want Lydia Sinclair on the guest list. Nate stared at her across the small desk in the mill manager's house. You want to invite the woman who has spent 3 months engineering our destruction to dinner? I want to invite her into a room where every person of consequence in Boston can watch what happens, Eleanor said. There's a difference. Walk me through it. She did. It took 20 minutes. By the end, Nate was sitting very still, with the expression he reserved for moments when he encountered an intelligence operating at a level that required him to genuinely pay attention. You've been building this, he said. How long? Since the Harbor Committee, she said. When I understood that Kearney's hostility was arranged, I started thinking about what arrangement would unmake it. The answer was the same thing that made it. A room full of people who matter, positioned correctly. And you're certain about Mrs. Aldrich? I'm certain that Franklin Aldrich owes you 3 favors and his wife admires me, Eleanor said, which is a more reliable foundation than certainty. And Judge Hale? My father appointed him to his first bench position 17 years ago. He will come. Kearney will come because if he doesn't, the absence will look like guilt. He knows that. A pause. He'll come because he still thinks he's managing a situation. He doesn't know yet that the situation has already been managed. Nate was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the mill town was winding toward midnight, quieter than it had been in weeks. What do you need from me? He said. I need you to stand next to me the entire evening, she said. Not behind me, not at a distance, managing conversations. Next to me, visibly, publicly, unambiguously. I can do that. And when the moment comes, she said, I need you to follow my lead without hesitating. Even if it surprises you. He looked at her for a long moment. What moment? I'll know it when it arrives, she said, and so will you. They returned to Boston the following day, with a second inspection completed, 3 positions reinstated, and Harlow's termination letter signed and in Prescott's hands before they left the property. The mill would resume limited operations within the week. The workers would receive their full wages. Prescott, who had spent 4 days managing a crisis alone, shook Nate's hand at the gate, with the grip of a man expressing something he didn't have the words for. Then he turned to Eleanor and said simply, Thank you for coming yourself, Mrs. Whitmore. Thank you for writing the letter, she said, and for making the right call on the shutdown before we arrived. Prescott nodded. He looked like a man who had been waiting a long time for someone to say that to him. The invitations went out on a Monday. By Wednesday, every acceptance had been received except one. Thomas brought Nate the news at the club with the particular gleam of a man who is enjoying himself tremendously. Lydia hasn't responded, he said. She will, Nate said. You're certain. Eleanor is certain. That's enough for me. Thomas put down his glass and looked at Nate with an expression that was several things simultaneously. Amused, assessing, something that might, in a less guarded man, have been called moved. She's changed you, Thomas said. You said that before, Nate said. So did Lydia. Lydia meant it as an insult, Thomas said. I mean it as an observation. You were a harder man 3 months ago, Nate. Harder and less present, like you were running the world from behind glass. Nate said nothing. She looks at you, Thomas continued. The way people look at problems they've decided to solve. But she also looks at you like, I don't know, like she's decided you're worth solving. That's a strange way to describe affection. Is it affection? Thomas said. Because from the outside, it looks like something considerably more durable than that. Lydia's response arrived Thursday afternoon. One line in her precise handwriting. Delighted to attend. Eleanor read it, folded it, and placed it in her folio with the expression of a chess player who has just confirmed the opponent has moved exactly where expected. Good, she said. The evening of the dinner, something was different about the Whitmore estate. Not the preparations. Those were flawless, because Eleanor had overseen every detail with the same precision she brought to survey documents and mill reports. It was something in the air of the house itself, something that had been building since July, since a woman had walked down an aisle and said, "I trust we understand each other," and had been quietly, systematically building its own logic ever since. Nate dressed in his study. When he came downstairs, Eleanor was in the front hall, already receiving the first guests. She wore deep green, not the ivory of the wedding, not anything meant to be overlooked or to signal modesty. A color that said, "I am here. I am not going anywhere." She looked up when she heard him on the stairs. For just a moment, one beat, enough to be real. Something moved between them that had no name yet, but was taking the shape of one. "Ready?" she said. "Ready," he said. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked into the room together. The evening moved well. It moved the way Eleanor had designed it to move. Naturally, apparently effortlessly, with the social precision of someone who understood that the most powerful arrangements are the ones that look like no arrangement at all. Judge Hale arrived with his wife, and immediately sought out Eleanor, greeting her with the warmth of a man who remembered her father well, and was disposed to extend that warmth to the daughter. Mrs. Aldrich worked the room on Eleanor's behalf with the focused energy of a convert, introducing her to 3 women of the Harbor Committee's extended circle, who had never before spoken to Eleanor directly, and came away from the conversations visibly recalibrated. Kearney arrived at 7, and moved through the room with careful composure. He greeted Nate. He greeted Eleanor with a correctness that was indistinguishable from warmth to anyone not watching for the absence beneath it. Eleanor received him with perfect graciousness, and moved on. Lydia arrived at 7:15. She was dressed beautifully. She was always dressed beautifully, and she carried herself with the composed assurance of a woman who has decided that the best defense is the appearance of having nothing to defend. She greeted several people near the door, accepted a glass of wine, and made her way through the room toward the corner, where Nate was speaking with Judge Hale. Eleanor intercepted her without apparent effort, moving through the crowd with the seamless ease of someone who had been tracking the room from her peripheral vision all evening. "Mrs. Sinclair," she said, "I'm so glad you could come." "Mrs. Whitmore." Lydia's smile was perfectly assembled. "What a lovely evening." "The house is magnificent. Thank you. I wanted to ask you something," Eleanor said, and her voice was warm, conversational, entirely without edge. "You've known Nate's uncle, Cornelius, for some time, I understand. Through the Cambridge social circle, the slightest pause, almost undetectable. We have acquaintances in common." "Yes, I thought so. We had a small legal matter recently. I'm sure you heard. A survey discrepancy on the conquered land. Entirely resolved now, of course." Eleanor smiled. "I mention it because the timing was rather curious. We'd barely been married 2 months when Cornelius suddenly discovered a filing error that predated both of us. I found myself wondering how he knew to look." Lydia's glass was very still in her hand. "These things surface in their own time." "They do," Eleanor agreed. "They also surface when someone points in the right direction. In this case, I suspect the direction was pointed by someone who had read the marriage contract, which was of course a private document, and had both the motivation and the access to use what they found in it." She paused. "The field is rather narrow when you think about it." The color in Lydia's face had shifted by precisely 2 degrees. Anyone not standing close would not have noticed. "I don't know what you're implying," Lydia said. "I'm not implying anything," Eleanor said pleasantly. "I'm describing a situation. The implication is yours to draw." She tilted her head slightly. "I also know about Kearney and Harlow. The sequence is fairly clear when you lay the timeline out." Now the color change was unmistakable. "You have no proof of anything," Lydia said, low and precise. "No," Eleanor said. "I don't need proof. Proof is for courts. What I have is something considerably more effective in Boston. A clear and detailed account of events that I am prepared to share at my discretion with every person in this room." She glanced around at Judge Hale, at Mrs. Aldrich, at 3 members of the Harbor Committee's inner circle who were currently engaged in animated conversation 15 feet away. This room, specifically. Lydia was very still. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "I want it to stop," Eleanor said, completely, permanently. "Whatever arrangement you have with Cerny, with Cornelius, with anyone else who has been using your access to our household's business, it ends tonight. No further legal maneuvering. No more managed introductions of the wrong people into positions of influence at our properties. No more letters to Cornelius. And if I agree, then this conversation stays between us," Eleanor said. "And you are welcome to attend my dinner parties indefinitely. I harbor no particular animosity toward you, Mrs. Sinclair. I understand you believed you were protecting something you valued, but you've been directing your energy toward the wrong target, and it's caused sufficient damage. Time to stop." A long pause. "You're more dangerous than I expected," Lydia said. "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "Most people are if you look directly at them." Nate had been watching from across the room. He had seen the conversation begin. He had seen Lydia's color change. He had seen the stillness, the pause, the moment of decision cross Lydia's face, as clearly as weather crossing an open field. He had not moved. He had trusted Eleanor's lead as he had promised. When Eleanor returned to his side 20 minutes later, she touched his arm lightly, the signal they had established on the road back from Lell. Done. He covered her hand with his for exactly 1 moment. Then he turned to the room. What happened next was not in Eleanor's plan. It was his own. He moved to the center of the gathering. It was a natural moment, the evening at its social peak, conversations at full current, and raised his glass. The room quieted the way rooms do when the host commands it out of long social habit. "Thank you all for being here," he said. "I want to take a moment, and I recognize this is irregular, and I apologize for it in advance to anyone who finds sentiment at dinner parties tiresome." Laughter moved through the room. "I want to say something that is overdue." He paused. 4 months ago, I entered a marriage I had the arrogance to consider a transaction. I want to be honest about that, because honesty in front of witnesses is the only kind that costs anything. Another pause. I was wrong about the transaction, about what I was walking into, about the person I was walking into it with. The room had gone very quiet. My wife has, in the course of 4 months, identified a financial risk that would have cost this household a significant portion of its northern holdings. She has addressed a labor safety failure at our mill that might otherwise have resulted in, I will not minimize it, deaths. She has corrected a data error before the Harbor Committee that saved this city considerable money. She has done all of this with a capability and a character that I did not adequately recognize, and I am recognizing it now in front of all of you, because she has earned it, and I have been slow to say so publicly. He turned to Eleanor. She was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face. Not the composed assessment, not the quiet fury, not the almost smile. Something completely unguarded for exactly 1 moment. Something that looked stripped of all its careful architecture, like a woman who had been braced for a long time and had just been allowed to stop. "Eleanor," he said, "thank you." The room was silent for 1 beat. Then Mrs. Aldrich started to applaud, and it spread, and in 30 seconds the entire assembled gathering of Boston's commercial and social elite was applauding Eleanor Winthrop Whitmore in the front room of the estate that now carried her name as much as his. Kearney applauded with everyone else because not applauding would have been noticed. Lydia applauded with everyone else because she had made a decision 20 minutes ago and understood what it required. Eleanor held Nate's gaze across the room. Then, with the deliberateness of a woman who chooses each action carefully, she nodded once. The way she nodded when something had been decided correctly, when the numbers came out right, when the outcome was the one that ought to have happened. The guests left by 10. The last carriage had barely cleared the drive when Eleanor sat down in the front parlor, not the formal sitting room, the actual parlor, the one the family used, and let out a long breath that she clearly had been holding for approximately 4 hours. Nate came in and sat across from her. For a moment, they were simply quiet. "Lydia," he said finally, "she'll hold to it." "You're sure?" "She's not a fool," Eleanor said. "She knows what I have. She also knows that continuing was going to cost her considerably more than stopping. She's a practical woman. I can respect practical women. Even ones who spent 3 months trying to dismantle your marriage. She wasn't trying to dismantle the marriage, Eleanor said. She was trying to reassert her position. There's a distinction. She didn't dislike me. She didn't know me. I was simply in the way of something she wanted. A pause. I understand that kind of motivation. It doesn't require hatred. It just requires want. Nate looked at her. You're remarkably fair to her. I'm accurate about her, Eleanor said, as usual, the edge of that not-quite smile. He recognized it better now. He knew what lived beneath it. The speech, she said. You didn't tell me. It wasn't part of the plan, he said. No. Did it? He stopped. He was not a man accustomed to asking this kind of question. Was it all right? She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her face that she did not compose away. It was considerably more than all right, she said quietly. Good. Why did you do it? She asked. Not strategy. I know it wasn't strategy. You could have waited. Let the evening speak for itself. Why tonight, in front of all of them? He was quiet for a moment, finding the honest version of the answer, rather than the manageable one. Because you walked into this marriage, he said, knowing exactly what it was, and conducted yourself with more integrity than it deserved, and nobody said so publicly. And I am the one who should have said it, and I kept not saying it because I was still operating from the assumption that things between us were. He stopped. Transactional, she offered. Yes, and they stopped being that a long time ago. I just took too long to admit it in front of witnesses. A pause. Longer than the others. Different in character. Nate, she said. Yes. The formal agreement, the one you mentioned after Cornelius. I remember. I'd like to discuss it now, she said, if you're still willing. I'm still willing. She reached into her folio. Of course, she had the folio. She always had the folio, and produced 2 sheets of paper covered in her precise handwriting. She set them on the table between them. He picked them up. It was a partnership agreement, not a legal document. Hargrove would make it legal, but a working document, setting out the operational structure of the Whitmore household and holdings in terms that named both parties explicitly. Joint decision-making on property matters above a specified value. Eleanor's formal role on the Harbor Committee. Her name on the mill management records. A provision about household accounts. A provision about the children they did not yet have, but the document acknowledged they might. He read it twice. You wrote this, he said. Last week, she said, before Lel. I was optimistic. This is what you wanted when you said you wanted to negotiate the terms. It's what I wanted from the beginning, she said. A real partnership, equal parts, or as equal as the law currently permits, which is limited, but more than most women have access to. She paused. If it's too much. Eleanor? His voice stopped her. Pick up your pen. She looked at him. You have a pen in that folio, he said. You always do. Pick it up. Slowly, she reached into the folio. Both sign, he said. Tonight. Hargrove gets it Monday. She held the pen. She was very still for a moment, and he understood, watching her, that Eleanor Witmore had been carrying this particular hope for a very long time, in the careful, protected way that people carry hopes they are not entirely sure are safe to have. The hope of being taken seriously, actually, formally, on paper, seriously. She signed. He took the pen from her hand and signed beneath her name and set the document on the table, and for the first time in 4 months, the Whitmore estate had a structure that matched its reality. She was looking at the signatures. 4 months ago, she said, I told myself that a woman's dignity is the one thing no man can put his name on. I remember. You said it at the altar. You heard that? I heard everything you said at the altar, he said. I just didn't know yet what to do with it. She looked up, and now the fire had burned low. The harbor bells rang 11. The Whitmore estate was quiet in the way it was never quiet during the day. Genuinely quiet, privately quiet. The quiet of a house that had stopped being a performance and become something else. Now, he said, I know. He reached across the table, not impulsively, not as a gesture, but with the deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is following through on it, and took her hand. She looked at his hand over hers. Then she turned her palm up, and Eleanor Winthrop Whitmore, who had sold herself for terms, who had arrived at a strange man's altar with a plan and a folio and the specific dignity of a woman who refuses to be reduced, held his hand in the front parlor of a house that was finally, actually, undeniably hers. "Well," she said softly, "that took long enough." He laughed, a real one, the kind that surprised him, and she smiled in return. The full version, the one she didn't compose or manage, and in the quiet of that room, the last of the transaction dissolved completely into something neither of them had been paid to feel, and neither of them any longer had the slightest intention of managing away. He was already awake when morning came. This had become a pattern he no longer fought, lying in the early dark, not with the restless, unlocated energy of the first weeks of the marriage, but with something quieter, something that was taking the shape of a man, beginning to understand what his life actually contained, as opposed to what he had planned for it to contain. He heard Eleanor moving in the east wing before 6. She was always moving before 6. He dressed and went downstairs and found her in the library. Not the folio this time, not the survey maps or the deed records. She was reading a letter, and something in the set of her shoulders told him, before he saw her face, that it was not good news. "What is it?" She held out the letter without speaking. He read it standing. It was from Judge Winthrop, her father. 2 pages, the handwriting less steady than usual, and when Nate reached the second paragraph, he understood why. "He's ill," Nate said. "Since August," Eleanor said. Her voice was even, but the evenness cost her something. "He didn't tell me. Why?" "Because he knew I would have—" She stopped. "He didn't want me distracted from the marriage. Those are his words. He believed I had enough to manage without worrying about him." How serious? "He says manageable. He says the physician is optimistic." She set the letter on the table. "My father says a great many things that are designed to prevent me from worrying. He has been doing this since I was 12. I have never once found it effective. Do you want to go to Concord?" She looked up at him. He saw the question behind her eyes, the one she was deciding whether to ask. "You wouldn't mind?" "Eleanor," he said, "your father is ill. We go to Concord." Something in her face moved, the specific movement of a person receiving uncomplicated kindness after a long period of having to negotiate for it. "Today," she said, "I'll tell the staff." Judge Winthrop lived in a federal-style house outside Concord that Eleanor had grown up in, and that still carried in its proportions and its habits the particular character of a man who believed strongly in order and loved impractically. He met them at the door himself, a gesture that spoke more to Nate of the man's ingrained stubbornness than any letter could. He was thinner than his portrait suggested. His handshake was firm, the kind of firmness a man consciously imposed, as if reminding himself to maintain it. "Nathaniel," he introduced himself, and confessed he'd never called him Nate. The shortened name seemed to strike him with the mild suspicion of someone who believed names were meant to be used in their entirety. Judge Winthrop turned to Eleanor. He studied her for a moment, his expression that of a man taking inventory of something precious, accounting for it with meticulous care. "You're angry with me," he stated. "Extraordinarily," she replied. "Come inside." They settled into the judge's study, the 3 of them. Winthrop spoke of his health with the reluctant thoroughness of a man who knew the truth would be unearthed regardless, and had thus decided to control its unveiling. "It was his heart," he explained, "not a catastrophic illness. The physician believed it was manageable, but it was real and demanded significant changes to the judge's life and work. He'd known since July." "July," Eleanor echoed, "before the wedding." "Yes, and you said nothing." "Father," her voice, though never raised, tightened with a force far more potent than volume. "I am your daughter. I am not a vessel for complications. I should have been told." Winthrop was silent for a beat. "You're right," he conceded. "I'm sorry." The directness of his apology seemed to surprise her. "Well," she said. "Good." Nate, who had been quietly observing from a corner, spoke up. "What do you need, Judge?" "Practically speaking." Winthrop looked at him. "The Concord estate management," he began, "has been—" "Practically," Eleanor interjected. A beat of silence. Winthrop looked from his daughter to the man she had married. Something shifted across the old judge's face, a fleeting expression with the texture of relief, and the palpable weight of a man who had borne his burdens alone for too long. "Company," Winthrop said softly. "Mostly. The physician says rest and limited work. The estate management can be handled by Collis's counterpart here. He's capable. What I find the house rather quiet as well." Eleanor stood, crossed the room, and sat beside her father on the bench. She placed her hand over his and remained silent, simply sitting there. The judge, a man of considerable dignity and little practice in receiving comfort, looked at his daughter's hand covering his and released a long, measured breath. "I'll arrange monthly visits," Eleanor said. "More often if needed. I don't want to be a burden." "You are my father," she added. "That category doesn't include burden." Nate looked away, granting them their moment. His gaze fell upon the wall of books in Winthrop's study. Law books, agricultural texts, 2 shelves of natural philosophy. He thought of a 14-year-old girl correcting a Harvard professor's arithmetic at a dinner party in a house not unlike this one, and the man who had raised her. He considered the shape a person takes when nurtured by someone who believed, even imperfectly, even with his particular brand of well-intentioned paternalism, that their mind was worth developing. "Judge," Nate said, turning back, "I want to say something." Both looked at him. "When the contract was drawn," he continued, "I treated it as an acquisition. I want you to know that I understand now what you actually gave me, and I am not unaware of the gap between those two things." Winthrop studied him for a long moment. The judge's eyes, honed by 40 years of determining truth, now bore the full weight of that practice. "She told you about the arithmetic," he said finally. "She mentioned it. I was proud of her for 2 weeks," Winthrop said. The professor had complained to half of Boston. A pause. "I was proud of her anyway." "You should have been," Nate said. The judge nodded once. The inventory look returned to his face, assessing his daughter, this man, the room, arriving at a conclusion. "Take care of her," he said. "She takes considerable care of herself," Nate replied. "But yes." They stayed for 2 days. What transpired in those 2 days was not dramatic. It was the antithesis of drama. It was the quiet, unforced, entirely private experience of 2 people tentatively negotiating the terms of a shared life, with the particular caution of the newly brave who are ready to actually live it. They walked the Concord estate with her father, who knew every inch of the land, and spoke of it with the uninhibited love of a man in the presence of those he trusted. Eleanor translated the agricultural details for Nate with the effortless ease of someone who had been doing it her entire life. Nate asked questions he wouldn't have known to ask 3 months prior, and the judge answered them with growing animation. By the second afternoon, the 3 of them stood in the northeastern field, discussing drainage with the focused urgency of people who had entirely forgotten it was meant to be a leisure visit. On the second evening, after the judge had retired, Nate and Eleanor sat in the garden in the summer darkness. For a long time, they said nothing at all. "You know what I was thinking about today?" Eleanor said finally. "Tell me." "The morning of the wedding," she said, "I was in my room getting dressed, and I was telling myself that dignity was the one thing no man could take, that I was going to hold on to that, regardless of how the marriage went." "I know," he said. "You said it at the altar." "I said it at the altar," she agreed. "And I meant it, but I was frightened. I didn't show it. I've had a great deal of practice not showing fear, but I was frightened." He listened in silence. "Not of you specifically," she said. "Of the category of being a woman handed from one man's household to another's, with a contract that nobody actually asked me to sign, of disappearing into it, of becoming decorative." She said the word as if it were a diagnosis. I had watched it happen to women I admired, women who were brilliant and capable and married the wrong configuration of man, and were slowly quieted, and I had made up my mind that it was not going to happen to me, regardless of what I had to do to prevent it. She turned to look at him in the dark. "And it didn't happen," she said. "Not because I prevented it alone. I did my part, but so did you. And I want to say that clearly, because I was prepared to fight for it by myself, and I didn't have to, and that matters." He held her gaze. "I should have made it easier from the beginning." "You made it possible from the middle," she said. "That counts." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had in the parlor after the dinner party, a gesture deliberately chosen, without performance. "Eleanor," he said, "I love you." The night was profoundly still. She looked at him for a moment, that long, honest, measuring look, and he saw in it every version of the woman he had encountered in 4 months. The woman at the altar with her folio, the woman finding the survey error at midnight, the woman telling 60 frightened workers they would be paid, the woman who had held Lydia Sinclair accountable in a crowded room with nothing but the truth and the willingness to use it. "I know," she said, "and I love you too. I have for longer than I was prepared to admit. When," she said, "when you went into the boiler room yourself, I didn't expect it. A man like you with your resources could have managed it from a distance. You didn't, you went in." A pause. "That was when I stopped managing my feelings about you and started simply having them." He laughed softly. "You managed your feelings about me extensively," she said with complete seriousness. "It required considerable effort." He brought her hand up and held it. She leaned against his shoulder. The Concord night was alive with the sound of crickets and the scent of the summer fields her father loved, and for a long time they simply sat in it. Two people who had found each other by the longest possible route, arrived at exactly the right place. The twist that came 3 weeks after their return to Boston was one neither of them had factored into any plan. It arrived in the form of a public letter, printed in the Boston Gazette of all places, under the signature of Silas Carney. Nate read it at breakfast. He read it twice. Then he handed it across the table to Eleanor without a word. She read it. Her expression shifted in ways he was now practiced at reading. Surprise, then rapid assessment, then something that settled into a stillness he recognized as her version of being genuinely affected. "He's withdrawing his opposition to my committee appointment," she said, her voice quiet. "Publicly." Nate said, "In print," and attributing it to, she looked at the letter again. A reconsideration of the evidence presented at the September Harbor Committee meeting, which demonstrated beyond reasonable question that Mrs. Whitmore's contributions to the committee's deliberations are of material value to the harbor's commercial interests. "He's protecting himself," Nate said. "The Lowell story got out. 3 separate accounts in the commercial press about what happened at the mill, including the worker wage commitments. His position has become untenable, and he knows it." "Yes," Eleanor said slowly. "But he didn't have to do it publicly. He could have simply stopped, gone quiet. This is public. Someone pushed him." She looked up. "Thomas." "Thomas," Nate confirmed. "I've been working the club circuit for 2 weeks. I told him to. I should have told you." She looked at him. "You deployed Thomas on my behalf without telling me." "I did. That was—" She stopped. "Actually, that was quite clever. I've been learning from the best available teacher," he said. She set the letter down and looked at him with the full, unguarded version of her smile, the one that still arrived 4 months into the marriage, with the quality of something being allowed rather than performed. "Well," she said, "I suppose I can forgive the lack of disclosure." "Generous of you. I have my moments." The final piece arrived from a direction that surprised them both. Lydia Sinclair left Boston in October. Not dramatically, no public announcement, no apparent disgrace. She simply relocated to Philadelphia, where she had a cousin, and where the particular social arithmetic of her situation in Boston no longer applied. Before she left, she sent a letter to Eleanor. 1 page. Eleanor read it privately and did not share its contents, and Nate did not ask. He understood by now the difference between the things that were his to know and the things that belonged only to Eleanor, and he respected it, the way he respected the boundary lines on a well-surveyed property. What he did know was that after Eleanor read the letter, she sat quietly in the library for 20 minutes. When he passed the door, he saw her looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a woman processing something that had required more of her than she had expected. He brought her tea, set it on the table, and left without speaking. An hour later, she appeared in his study doorway. "She apologized," Eleanor said simply. "Did you believe her?" "Yes." A pause. "That's the complicated part." He nodded. He didn't push. She said that she had spent 6 years building something she believed was real, and when she saw it threatened, She reacted the way people react when they're frightened. She said she knew it didn't excuse what she did. She said she hoped that someday I might understand that a person can be genuinely sorry for a harm they genuinely chose to cause. Can they? I think so, Eleanor said. I think it's one of the more painful things a person can be. She came into the room and sat down. I'm not angry anymore, she said. I was. For a long time I was very angry, but I've been trying to understand what I want to carry forward. And anger at a woman who has already lost and left, that is a weight I'd rather set down. He looked at her. You're a better person than I am. You would have gotten there, she said. You get there. You're slower, but you arrive. That may be the kindest thing you've ever said to me. Don't push it, she said, and the smile was back quick and genuine and entirely hers. Hink. November brought the first cold and the formal ratification of the partnership agreement. Hargrove had worked through 3 drafts, each one reviewed by Eleanor with the thoroughness of a woman who understood that documents outlast conversations and must therefore be written to stand alone. The final version was 4 pages. It named both Whitmore parties explicitly in every provision. It established Eleanor's formal role in the estate management, the mill oversight, and the harbor committee engagement. It contained a provision Hargrove had never drafted before he admitted this, about shared decision-making authority on any sale or acquisition above a specified value binding on both parties equally. Hargrove said when they signed it, I want you to know that in 30 years of practice, I have never produced a document quite like this one. Is that a problem? Eleanor asked. On the contrary, Hargrove said. It is the most clearly written property agreement I have produced in 30 years, because it actually describes what is real. They took the signed documents home. Eleanor put her copy in the folio. Nate put his in the estate records next to the corrected survey and the original marriage contract. And for a moment he held both documents, the one from July 47 pages of commercial transaction, and the one from November, 4 pages of actual truth, and thought about the distance between them and what it had taken to cross it. Judge Winthrop came to Boston for Christmas. He was better than he had been in October. The physician's optimism had proven for once to be accurate rather than diplomatic, and he arrived with the energy of a man who has been given his health back and intends to use it. He brought 3 crates of Concord apples and a set of law books for Eleanor that he had been holding since she was 16, waiting for the right moment. Why now? She asked, unwrapping them. Because now they'll be used, he said. They've been waiting for a household where that was certain. She looked at her father over the stack of books. Then she crossed the room and embraced him, which she did not do often, being a woman who expressed affection through action rather than gesture. And the judge held his daughter with the particular grip of a man who had been worried for a long time about whether he had given her enough of the right things. You turned out well, he said into her hair. You had something to do with it, she said, marginally. More than marginally. He pulled back and looked at her. Then he looked at Nate across the room. And him. Him too, Eleanor said. Eventually. Winthrop laughed. A real one. The full version that reorganized his face completely. Good girl, he said. Keep him honest. Daily, she said. Mog. The harbor expansion began in the spring of 1816. Following the corrected channel survey that Eleanor had introduced to the committee 7 months prior, the dredging of the secondary inlet, the one whose silting she had identified from 2 captains' reports that nobody else had bothered to read, was completed in March. Transit time improvements came in at 6%, beating the original projection. Toll revenue exceeded the revised estimate. Franklin Aldrich wrote a letter to Nate about it, at the bottom in his own hand. Your wife was right. Please tell her I said so. Eleanor read it and said, he could have written to me directly. He'll learn, Nate said. They all will, she said. Give them time. The mill reopened fully in February, with all 3 supervisory positions restored, and a new inspection protocol that Prescott had drafted with Eleanor's input, and that would be referred to in subsequent years as the model for the region. The east boiler was replaced entirely. Nate's decision made without waiting for the next warning sign. The workers who had been in the mill that July knew what had happened. They knew who had come in person, who had made the promise in front of witnesses, who had made sure it was kept in the particular way that information moves through communities of people who have learned to pay careful attention to who shows up and who doesn't. This was not forgotten. 1 year after the wedding, on a July afternoon, with the harbor glittering and the city full of the specific heat and noise of a Boston summer, in full voice, Eleanor stood in the front room of the Whitmore estate and read through the annual estate accounts with the focused attention of a woman doing work she was built for. Nate came in and sat across from her. She didn't look up. The Northern Mill revenue is up 18%. I know the Harbor Committee has approved the secondary pier expansion that's 2 years ahead of the original projection. I know the Concord Estate drainage improvement has been implemented in March appears to have worked. My father's orchard is showing stronger growth than the previous 3 seasons combined. Eleanor, she looked up. He was watching her with the expression she had come to know as his version of the unguarded one, the one he had taken considerably longer than her to develop, but which once developed had proven to be entirely genuine. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I'm just looking at you." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she set the accounts down. 1 year, she said. 1 year. It was a very long year. It was, he agreed. "Are you sorry?" she asked, not anxiously. Honestly, the direct, frank version of a question that deserved a direct, frank answer. He leaned forward across the table and took her face in his hands, which was not a thing he did often, and was therefore, when he did it, a thing that meant something. And he looked at her with the full weight of everything the last 12 months had built between them, the boiler and the folio and the dinner party and the midnight survey and the signed agreement and the judge's letter and the Harbor Committee and the Lydia Sinclair of it all, and said, "The only thing I'm sorry for is the time I wasted believing I already knew what I had." She looked at him, the measured, honest, direct look, taking inventory, arriving at a conclusion. "Good answer," she said. "I've been practicing." She leaned forward and kissed him, unhurried, certain, the way Eleanor Witmore did everything that she had decided was worth doing. When she pulled back, she picked up the accounts again. "The mill," she said. "We need to talk about the spring expansion now. The numbers won't wait because we're sentimental," she said. He laughed. He sat back. He looked at his wife, at the woman who had walked into his life with a folio and a plan, and the specific, unbreakable dignity of a person who had decided a long time ago that she would not be reduced, and felt, with the quiet completeness of a man who has finally stopped running the numbers and started understanding what they actually mean, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Eleanor Winthrop Whitmore had not been sold into a marriage. She had walked into one with her eyes wide open, negotiated its terms on her own conditions, refused every invitation to disappear, and built from the wreckage of a transaction, something real. And in doing so, she had not just saved an estate, or a mill, or a survey record, or a Harbor Committee vote. She had saved the man who had been too proud and too certain and too behind glass to save himself, and that, in the summer of 1816, in the city of Boston, in the front room of a house that carried both their names on the deed, was the only accounting that mattered.